Science fiction writers have this eerie way of predicting the future, and sometimes real life becomes stranger than fiction. Our guest today has a fertile mind that grapples with the big questions. Where's humanity going? How will developments in science and technology shape our future? We are guaranteed to have an interesting conversation today because the possibilities really are endless. Our guest today is Robert J. Sawyer. He's the only Canadian writer to have won 3 major awards for Best Science Fiction Novels of the Year, the World Science Fiction Society's Hugo Award, the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America's Nebula Award, and the John W. Campbell Memorial Award. Hi, Robert.
Hi, Sam. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
I am so excited for where this conversation could go today. Let's start with Oppenheimer, because you wrote the Oppenheimer Alternative, which is timely considering all of the buzz around Christopher Nolan's film. What did you think of the movie?
Yes, indeed. So my latest novel is called The Oppenheimer Alternative, and I started writing it before in fact, I published it before Christopher Nolan had announced that he was making this summer blockbuster film, the $180 million film, Oppenheimer. I went to see it, and I went to see it in the way that Christopher Nolan wants you to see it, which is 70 millimeter IMAX. And it's now almost, a week and a half since I've seen it.
Uh-huh.
And my opinion goes down with every passing day. The more I think about it, the less there is to that film. I liked it I loved it when I first came out of it. And then I thought, I loved it in large measure because of all the research I had done in writing my own book. So little things that are in the background that I had to acknowledge that Nolan had put in there meant something to me. But I think the general audience is going to walk out of there. To give one example, in a couple of scenes, there's a guy in the background playing bongos. What a crazy thing to have, right? Well, that guy happens to be Richard Feynman, one of the most interesting of the physicists involved with the Manhattan Project, which Oppenheimer was the scientific director of.
Right.
But because Nolan made this decision to call his film not the Manhattan Project and not, the regrettable bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but rather Oppenheimer, he focuses so laser sharp on that one character played by Cillian Murphy in the movie that this panoply of oddballs and crazies who were surrounding Oppenheimer get very short shrift in the film. And I think that was a huge mistake.
Interesting. I really enjoyed the movie, but I obviously don't have the research background that you do. And it's funny when you have that intimate knowledge of a topic that you can tell when things are missed or when they really nail something that maybe the general public doesn't even know is a key figure. So I think the bongos comparison is a great example of that. How does your book reimagine the experience of Robert Oppenheimer?
So there's a category in science fiction called alternate history, and that's where mine is kind of slotted in. But I really think of it as a secret history. In his own discussions, J. Robert Oppenheimer said some very intriguing things that no one has ever figured out what he was talking about. Very prominently figured in in the movie starring Cillian Murphy is the character of Louis Strauss, who is played by, I think the Academy Award for this movie is going to go to Robert Downey Jr. I think he's much better as Louis Strauss than Cillian Murphy is as Oppenheimer. But Strauss pushed for a security review board hearing of Oppenheimer. Well, when that's what his friends called him. I like to think of myself as a friend of his. When Oppie was going into that, a reporter said, "Hey, what's going on here?" And he said, "Well, if you," meaning any reporter, but he was pointing at specific ones, "if you were to dig deeply enough, you would find that there is a much bigger story here than just my security review board hearing." Oppie never explained what he meant about that. But, that's catnip to a science fiction writer. What was that story? And that's what I set out to write in the Oppenheimer Alternative. A narrative about Oppenheimer and all of these scientists around him, Edward Teller, Enrico Fermi, Albert Einstein, and so forth, that doesn't contradict anything that we know in the historical record, but goes off in quite an interesting science fictional direction.
Can you give us a teaser of which way, where you actually go with it without ruining the story?
Well, the most famous thing that Oppenheimer is said to have said is, and it's in the movie certainly, is "Now I am become death." the destroyer of worlds.
Right.
He's didn't say it until Edward R. Murrow interviewed him some years later on CBS, but he says that he thought it when he saw the first atomic bomb explosion. And after the bombing of not Hiroshima, but 3 days later, Nagasaki, Oppie had a change of heart and said, this is a horrible thing that I've been involved with. So I wanted to give him and the other Manhattan Project scientists a chance to go from Oppie saying, now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds, to we have become life, the saviors of our world. And the Manhattan Project scientists stay together to stave off an ecological crisis that threatens our planet, very much as we are threatened right now in the present day, of course, by an ecological crisis.
Okay, that takes me to my next question. You've made some predictions in previous books. We hear all the time about The Simpsons and how they strangely predict the future. But science fiction also sometimes strangely predicts the future. What have you written about that's come true?
Well, the one I get the most email about, and it was actually a simple one. They say, how could you possibly have done that? When John Paul II was succeeded by Pope Benedict the 16th, people said, how did you predict who was going to be the next Pope? So far, because I predicted it more than a decade before it happened. And the answer is, this is. I'm giving away trade secrets. The magician never wants to tell how the trick is done. But what I did was I looked at the list of all the names of popes. Very unusual for a pope to take a new name that hasn't been used previously.
Right.
So I looked at all the ones that have been previously used, scratched off the ones that, of course, had been disgraced for one reason or another. For instance, collaborating a little bit with Hitler in World War II. Well, that name ain't ever coming back. And it looked like Benedict was due for a comeback, and the last one was 15, so 16 next in line. And that's what the science fiction writer does. So you said in the introduction, and I don't dispute it, but that we have this odd ability to predict the future, sometimes quite accurately. But it really is an extrapolation from what we already know into what likely is going to happen. And once you start in the past and work forward to the present and see what the trend is, the extrapolation into the future is not magic. It's just rational thought.
Mm-hmm. So you're just almost playing a game of odds.
You are. And I must say, now that said, that great quote from Frank Herbert, of course, best known for writing the novel Dune, famously made, speaking of blockbuster films, Denis Villeneuve, a great Canadian director, made the most recent adaptation of Dune. But he said, of course, that often our job is not predicting the future, but preventing the future. And that's absolutely right. We don't necessarily say, this is what's going to happen. What we say, it's a little more complex. This is what's going to happen unless we make a course correction. We're giving you the heads up that we're like, using another Canadian reference, the distant early warning line for the future. We've looked ahead, extrapolated forward, and if we don't change our course, we're going to end up huge overpopulation, nuclear holocaust, environmental degradation, any number of the dystopian scenarios that you alluded to in the introduction. Mm-hmm. But we don't want them to come true. We're happiest in most cases because we sounded a warning bell, it doesn't happen because the public listened.
I want to go to the phones because I want to include our listeners in this conversation, because I am not an avid science fiction reader, but I do read some science fiction. And I know whenever I get into it, there's always a conversation afterwards about something that's happened. And I want to make sure that everyone listening has the opportunity to join the conversation as well. Maria is on the line in Swift Current. Hi, Maria.
Hi. It's really interesting you talking about giving a heads up for people, and this is what could happen. Because I've often wondered, especially after reading Black Elk Speaks, he talks about having visions and needing to act them out for them to materialize. And I wonder if in this attempt to warn people about the course we're on, if it actually becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and because that idea has been put out in the universe, that's what we're gravitating towards. Because I once heard someone say that the universe doesn't hear negatives.
That's a very profound question, an interesting one, particularly because we're talking about Oppenheimer. The atomic bomb, the name we use for it came from not Oppenheimer or any scientist. It came from H.G. Wells in one of his science fiction novels. He predicted the atomic bomb way before it was a reality. And famously, in the introduction, it was mentioned that I have won the John W. Campbell Memorial Award. Well, who's John W. Campbell? He was the editor of Astounding Science Fiction, now published under a new title, Analog Science Fiction, the world's leading English language science fiction magazine. And before the Manhattan Project had managed to build an atomic bomb, he had published a story by a guy named Cleve Cartmel in Astounding magazine, Astounding Science Fiction, very precisely describing how an atomic bomb might be built. The FBI actually descended on the New York City offices of this magazine and on Campbell himself and said, how did you, do you have spies? What are you doing? You're leaking government secrets. No. Anybody who was paying attention to the publicly published scientific papers of the last 10 years would know that we're working on this. And we didn't mean to put the cat out of the bag, but anybody who had their antennae, let's say, attuned to science news would know that we were probably going to have an atomic bomb sometime in the mid-1940s.
Maria, you wanted to reference Fahrenheit 451 as well.
Or as we call it here in Canada, Celsius 233. But
just because I find it interesting how it's a world where people are essentially in front of screens all the time. And that's what's happened. And, even the robotic dogs that go after people. I was at a farm show, it was probably 5 years ago or so, and Nutrien showed a video of robotic dogs that were trained to grab a cell phone. And now we have, this book about robotic dogs, we have robotic dogs out there, and people have GPS devices on them all the time. It's a little disturbing. And if you look at the history of the vehicle even, as soon as Henry Ford invented the vehicle, somebody was weaponizing it and turning it into a tank. And I think if we learn from history, everybody is, like any piece of technology, they are turning into weapons. And I think we need to take this a lot more seriously than we are, because all of the evidence suggests that these, if they're just warnings or self-fulfilling prophecies, are manifesting. And I think it's about time we do something about it.
Well, of course, what we don't want to do is what Bradbury was also writing about in Fahrenheit 451, which is burn the books. You can't say that, the prophet should not be allowed to make the prediction. That said, a couple of friends of mine, Garfield and Judith Reeves Stevens, Canadian science fiction writers, had written a thriller in which, airplanes were used to attack skyscrapers, which that was published prior to, of course, the horrendous thing that happened on September 11th, 2001. The reality is the ideas are going to be put out there, but those of us who are putting out the ideas are not the ones who are normally able to enact them. My own mantra about this is, if the smartest people in the world, meaning like the scientists of the Manhattan Project, didn't keep doing the things that the stupidest people in the world, like the warmongers and those who want to weaponize everything, ask them to do, the world would be a better place. Yes, the United States military, and presumably the Soviet military, probably the German military, Japanese, lots of militaries wanted nuclear weapons, but none of the generals or foot soldiers could make them. If the scientists simply said, yeah, we could do that, but we aren't going to do that, we never would have had them. And in fact, there's the famous play, Copenhagen, about Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg, Heisenberg being the leader of Hitler's atomic effort. And of course, Frayne, the author of that play, makes the case that Heisenberg deliberately misled Der Führer about the potential possibility of making a nuclear bomb. He told Adolf Hitler, according to Frayne, history we don't really know, it can't be done, because he knew that if he did do it, that the world would fall to Nazism, even though, obviously Werner Heisenberg was under Hitler's thumb. There were an awful lot of Germans who were not at all in favor of what Hitler was doing.
Very interesting thoughts. Maria, thank you so much for your call. Robert, where do you get your ideas for these books? Because they're all quite different.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, I like to be a guy where people, I'd like to be the Forrest Gump's mother's box of chocolates of writers. I want people to say, Sawyer's novels are like his shelf of novels, like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get next. Because I do love being able to write a variety of different things. I've written science fiction romance, science fiction courtroom drama, science fiction action adventure, science fiction history, like in my novel, you alluded to the Oppenheimer Alternative. And I love doing that. But all of it comes from being a voracious consumer of nonfiction. I read enormously in popular science and also technical papers in scientific journals, history, philosophy. When you said in your call for people to call, are you writing a science fiction novel yourself? Whenever I'm teaching science fiction writing, the first question I ask the students, the people who want to be science fiction writers, is, what are you currently reading? Astonishes me that a lot of people who want to be writers aren't reading anything. They're watching TV, they're watching movies, but they somehow want to write books for some reason, or that they're only reading science fiction. You certainly should read science fiction, especially if you want to write it, but you've got to read history, you've got to read science, you've got to read politics. And the ideas come from really trying to, science fiction is the biggest canvas of any form of literature, all of space, all of time, all forms of life. You have to be reading voraciously and in nonfiction, and the ideas will just leap out at you if you do that.
So, Robert, what are you reading right now?
I've been reading, I just finished reading a book. I listened to it as an audiobook, but
that's still reading.
We're doing radio here, so absolutely, let us not deprecate the spoken word. Dopamine Nation, which is a book about how, Maria, our first caller, alluded to the fact that we're addicted to screens, right? Telephone screens and computer screens. And it's that little hit of dopamine, a neurotransmitter that we love getting all the time, that reinforcement. And that was, absolutely fascinating. And that Dopamine Nation is leading into the book that I'm writing right now, which is called Domestic Us, about artificial intelligences potentially using dopamine as a training device to essentially domesticate us, domesticate Homo sapiens, so that we no longer present a threat to them. But, the understanding of neurotransmitters, of how they addict us to mindless, mind-numbing behaviors, such as infinitely scrolling on Facebook, that comes out of the science reading.
That's moderately terrifying. We're going to talk about AI a little bit later on in the show, but I want to go to the phones. James is in Saskatoon, and James, you read a book written in the 60s that you say still sticks with you.
Yeah, I read it in about 68. It's called The Burning World. It was by J.G. Ballard. And the premise of it is that the hydrological cycle is interrupted because of petrochemicals and plastics, and which prevents evaporation and the desertification of the whole planet. And that's something we're kind of seeing right now.
Absolutely. I mean, terrifying. And this is, the flip side of what we were saying earlier on about making predictions is science fiction writers. I was saying this to my friend Robert Charles Wilson, another Hugo Award-winning Canadian science fiction writer, at dinner a couple of weeks ago. I feel like Cassandra from Greek mythology was the prophetess who absolutely, reliably could tell you what your future was, and nobody would listen to her. Right? And it's no fun, honest to God. We science fiction writers don't want to be the smug SOBs who at the end of the day say, I told you so. We want to be the ones who say, see, you got it wrong. You told us about these awful things and they never happened. And we just can say to ourselves, because we warned you. That's why. So you're absolutely right. There was lots and lots of prediction of the kind of climate crisis. Sometimes it was quite specific scientific underpinnings, as you mentioned in there, an interruption of the hydrological cycle and petrochemicals contributing to that. And it makes us crazy. One of my favorite science fiction films from 1967 is called Quatermass and the Pit. And it's an adaptation of a British science fiction TV serial the BBC did in the 1950s. And there's a line in it where one scientist says to another, what if we discovered, and this was 1967, so they didn't know this yet, what if we discovered that our world was doomed, say, by climate change? What do you suppose we would do about it? Another scientist says, nothing. Just go on squabbling like usual. That's the epitaph for the human race there, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be on our tombstone. We were warned. We decided it was too much trouble to do anything about it. And now we're dead.
That's dark. That's really dark, Robert. James, thanks so much for your call. Chris in Regina is looking for some predictions from you, Robert. Chris, go ahead.
Yes, good afternoon. So I was interested, Robert, in your take on Oppenheimer, and interested also in you talking about the various kinds of things that you read. I think if more people did that, we'd have a much better informed populace, and our political situation wouldn't be quite as scary as it seems to be trending these days. But I wanted to ask you, based on your readings, your assessment of things, if you had to make a prediction about the state of our world in, say, 20 years, what would you say the outcome would be? You know, is it going to be we crash into global fascism? Is it going to be, ecological collapse? Is it going to be a third world war and a nuclear holocaust? Any and all of the above. I'd really be interested in hearing your predictions.
And they're all, sadly, quite likely possible futures. I think, though, that I'm an optimist, despite the fact that, we're talking about dystopias today. Most of my science fiction is optimistic. I think that the most arrogant thing any human being ever did was Carl Linnaeus, is the guy who gave us our species name, Homo sapiens, which is, Latin for humans who are wise. And that's like really arrogant to think. There are a lot of things you can say. If you're going to name one characteristic for our species, I'm not sure wisdom is the one that leaps to mind, right? But that's our name, Homo sapiens. And I like to think that we're going to finally, they say this famously about one of my favorite lines about Americans. And I know we have a few listening from over the border here, and I hope they take it in the spirit of jest that it's meant. Americans always do the right thing after they've tried everything else, right? And that can apply to Homo sapiens in general, that eventually, when a crisis gets so spectacularly big, we're going to do the right thing. Well, what's the right thing to do in a world where most jobs are being eliminated by artificial intelligence? Universal basic income. There's a lot of really good scholarship that shows that, an income that is not tied to a needs assessment and has no social stigma associated with it. We use these pejorative terms, you're on the dole, you're taking a handout. No. A universal basic income where everybody is paid a living wage from the general coffers, I think is a quite conceivable outcome of the AI revolution, when there simply cannot be full or even majorly portion of the workforce gainfully employed. I'm not necessarily a big fan of Bill Gates, but Bill Gates said a number of years ago, and I think this was one of the bright things that he did say, if a job is eliminated by a company in favor of automation, that company should have to continue to pay to the government in equivalent of tax dollars what that employee would have paid in as income tax. Right? That's how we fund things. You shouldn't be able to say, a human being who had a job and paid income tax and paid into the common benefit to make possible the roads and the infrastructure and schools and healthcare is eliminated, and therefore any contribution to the general welfare is also eliminated by a machine. Companies should not be allowed to do that. Way more than taxing the handful of multi-billionaires, which certainly they should be taxed, we should be taxing corporations and making sure that they are, they want all the protection of being citizens, right? American law, Citizens United, that gave them all kinds of rights that are reserved to citizens, human beings. The responsibilities have to go with that too. And supporting the common wheel, the Commonwealth, as we call it here in Canada, is hugely, I think, the path to a prosperous future, even with AI in the ascendancy.
Thanks for your call, Chris. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay, bye.
Okay, I want to get to some emails here. Keith writes, I love all science fiction and follow science of SpaceX and NASA, but feel there is no hope of colonizing another planet. I need Nicole to scroll the screen down here just 1 second. Too far, Nicole. Of colonizing another planet before we destroy this one. So I feel governments and corporations should focus more on money on this planet's numerous issues. Thoughts on that, Robert?
Yeah, no, this is a very interesting question because, of course, numerous people have said the rationale for colonizing, let's say, Mars or building self-floating space colonies is because we have all our eggs in one basket. One crazy guy, one Vladimir Putin or one Kim Jong-un can hit that red button and start a nuclear holocaust that's going to destroy the world. Or our climate change, we're here in Canada where there are fires burning all over the place at lots of places in the world. That any number of things could cause human civilization to collapse, including the artificial intelligence apocalypse. Anytime, and we have, if every human being, except for a couple up on the International Space Station, in the universe is in this one basket, we're doomed. And so that's the rationale. And the problem is, Elon Musk talks a great deal about wanting to colonize Mars. We've not colonized in any meaningful way Antarctica. Antarctica is warmer than Mars. Antarctica has air you can breathe. Mars does not. Antarctica has a huge supply of fresh water. All you have to do is melt the ice and you've got drinking water. Mars has very little, no surface water whatsoever. So the fact that Antarctica has proven to be inhospitable enough that we've never bothered to colonize it, of all the continents on the planet, the idea that somehow an appreciable number of us are going to colonize Mars, an even less hospitable place, seems not science fiction, which is rational extrapolation, but fantasy, which is things that'll never happen, I think is a real valid issue there. So yes, our number one priority as a species should not be, let's get a nucleus of us somewhere else because we've given up any hope of this crucible that we all were born in surviving. The number one priority should be making sure that Earth and human beings, that we earn that sapiens label and Homo sapiens. And so, yeah, money spent here. Our efforts should be not on how can we escape, a few of us escape before the end, but how can we make sure the end doesn't happen at all?
Okay. I want to talk to you about Quantum Night because the subject matter of it is, I don't want to say so on the nose, but it's so on the nose. Set in 2020, written in 2016. Walk us through what it's about and why it resonated so much with your readers.
That's right. Quantum Night, which is my novel just before the Oppenheimer Alternative. So my penultimate novel is about the rise of a psychopathic authoritarian leader, particularly in the United States in that novel, who, basically ruins everything. And in the novel, actually annexes Canada. And I actually came up with a scenario that I thought, again, you're trying to extrapolate reasonably. What would have driven, this was before Donald Trump had even announced that he was running for presidency, let alone a second time running for presidency. But what would incense that kind of character? Now, we're a wonderfully multicultural country. I happen to be a member of the Order of Canada. The superpower that goes with being a member of the Order of Canada is you get to officiate at Canadian citizenship ceremonies. I have sworn in thousands of Canadian citizens, personally myself, from around the globe. I love the multiculturalism of this country. And it was extremely plausible, it seemed to me in 2016 when I was writing that novel, that the next prime minister, Justin Trudeau was prime minister at that point, as he is now, but the next prime minister might be a Muslim. It might, in fact, I named one. I named Nashid Nensi, who was the mayor of Calgary and had just been named by the World Mayors Foundation, which, is an organization of mayors all over the world, as the world's leading mayor. The number one mayor in the whole world was Nashid Nensi in Calgary. And I thought, if he decided to throw his hat in the, maybe for the NDP, maybe for the Liberals, given who he was, he might become prime minister. And imagine the United States with a white supremacist authoritarian leader looking right next door to a country with a practicing Muslim head of state, Canada. what might happen there. And that's what Quantum Night is all about. But this idea, this rise of authoritarianism that we've seen in now, 7 years since that book came out, not just in the United States, a huge shift to the right throughout Europe. What we had this wonderful dream of a united Europe falling apart with a shift to the right and the departure, the Brexit of Great Britain, not so great anymore from the United Europe. Scary stuff. But looking around, one of the things I mentioned, Cassandra, the lesson of World War II should have been authoritarianism bad, right? And borders are now fixed. We're not going to play this game of annexing and taking over. Well, guess what? Authoritarianism is on the rise. Putin decided that, that border with Ukraine, we'll just erase that. And that could just as easily happen with the United States looking north, whether it's because they don't like who's in, Ottawa as the prime minister, or whether they just want our clean, fresh water and natural resources in a declining environmental circumstance. The longest undefended border in the world is, a great sign of friendship, but it is also a vulnerability.
But also predicting overturning Roe v. Wade.
I did predict that, and I'd predict that in an even earlier book, too, 20 years ago. And, people were telling me that wasn't good. No, settled law is the phrase that we heard over. It's settled law. And we heard it from all those Trump-appointed Supreme Court nominees. And they were all asked, well, what is your opinion on Roe v. Wade? And, Brett Kavanaugh and the others said, it's settled law. Well, as soon as they had the power, it was unsettled law. And we have seen, I remember, when same-sex marriage became legal in Canada in 2003, forgive me. So 20 years ago now, and eventually right across the United States. And now we see the clawback of LGBTQ Two-Spirit plus rights across the United States, Canada, and countries outlawing. It's huge steps back. And so, I did predict some of the backlash. I'm not in favor of the backlash. I wish I'd been wrong about that. But it seemed obvious to me that, in fact, we were saying settled law, issue resolved for all time, when in a lot of pretty dark hearts and minds, no, they were just waiting for their opportunity to claw it back.
Okay, so would you say fans of science fiction are escaping the world we live in?
No.
That they're looking. What are we doing when we pick up a science fiction book, particularly ones that might predict things that could happen?
The first modern futurist, in fact, the guy who popularized the term was Alvin Toffler. And he wrote a book in 1970 called Future Shock, which was a gigantic mainstream bestseller, nonfiction, New York Times bestseller. And he said reading science fiction is the only preventive medicine against future shock. The people who are reading science fiction are trying to get dispatches from the future. They're trying to, I like to say science fiction is the WikiLeaks of science. We get the stories out there that are going to affect your life way before the working scientists, who, remember, they are beholden to granting bodies. They're beholden to tenure review boards. They're afraid of saying, well, I've got this brain implant that I'm thinking of building here. And I'm saying, it might help people with Parkinson's. What I really want to do is hook people up to the World Wide Web so they can answer any question anytime. Just by thinking about it. But I'm going to say, no, it's just for Parkinson's research, because otherwise I'll lose my funding. The science fiction writer, me, my colleagues, we're the ones who can say, no. One of our callers mentioned Henry Ford and the invention of the automobile. Anybody after the invention of powered engines, steam engines, and so forth, could have predicted the individual conveyance that would be powered by some kind of gas-driven engine. But only a science fiction writer would have predicted the traffic jam. Only a science fiction, anybody could have predicted the airplane. Only a science fiction writer would have predicted airport lounges, frequent flyer miles, and airplanes being flown into buildings as our first caller, Maria, said, weapons of war. We're not here to let you escape reality. We're here to give you a heads up so you can better deal with reality.
Okay, coping mechanism. I got it.
Coping mechanism.
Let's go to the phones. Jody in Regina. He has some thoughts on social media in the future. Jody, go ahead.
Well, good afternoon. Interesting program. Well, first of all, you had made a comment earlier about writing based on rationality or fantasy. I think my comments or questions are going to be more on the latter. But, social media, I'm not a Luddite. I love technology, but social media is not something I partake in. I find it really, really nasty. I think we all know what I'm referring to there. But interestingly for me, and I won't get into paranormal stuff, but I just want to make an assumption that, and we're not talking decades, probably centuries, millennia, I'm going to say that human beings will be telepathic. So my thoughts at this stage with social media is that we're at the very, very beginning training ground for human beings to get to that state. Because right now, everybody's anonymous, everybody's nasty to each other. But if you meet most people 99% of the time in person, they're never like that. So I think when we reduce the anonymity and people are actually tied to the real person, I think we as a species are going to start to calm down, have a little bit more respect for each other. We're slowly condition ourselves to the point where we can be telepathic. Because can you imagine right now if you could read people's minds? My goodness. Anyway, just your thoughts on that.
Well, the thing that actually, we shouldn't be Homo sapiens, we should be Homo empathicus, empathetic beings, because the ability for humans to feel empathy when they're interacting face to face, you're exactly right. The depersonalization and the anonymization that happens in social media brings out the worst in us. You will say the nastiest thing to somebody. We just saw it, actually, just a wave of it on social media yesterday. Think what you want of our current prime minister. His marriage just fell apart. And people were saying the nastiest things to any human being whose marriage has just fallen apart, who's lost a child, who has, got a cancer diagnosis, whatever it is. In real life, face to face, you would never say the most base, awful things that immediately come up on social media, whether it's a famous person like the Trudeaus or whether it's just Joe Blow. This poor SOB has got cancer, and you make some joke about it, right? Horrible. We're horrible in that environment. So whether we will link up a broader bandwidth so that more than just our words, but some of even our pheromones, which although we're not conscious of, dogs are aware. Dog can tell, they say they smell fear on you. They smell fear. They smell joy. They smell sexual arousal. They smell anger. They smell all of the chemicals that you're giving off. And a wider pipe, thicker bandwidth for social media that allows our empathy to shine through, absolutely, is the only way it's going to stop being the toxic sludge pile that it absolutely is.
Thanks for your call. And James in Saskatoon, you have comments on near-death experiences and energy, which I'm intrigued about. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I have one of the smartest guys I ever known conveyed to me. He says that real life will always be more bizarre than fiction. And that's a beauty of concept that I think we should all relish, because we can read and we can watch movies and have all of the predictive programming that entails from them. I always believe that fantasy and fanciful thought, it creates creativity, and it's the expansion of one's thoughts, as opposed to just being a political driver. But I say this because as somebody who has had the great experience of this, and you understand where basically at the end of the day, it all becomes energy, right? It's either black or white, positive or negative, 1 or 0. And it very much is the essence of Zen. And so when, as your previous caller mentioned, about how social media is a training ground for us, it is. Thus far, because of algorithms and many constructs that are politically driven, people feel that the internet is a hurtful place. I actually believe that it has a great opportunity to be very positive. And I actually see this on a regular basis. It goes to the essence of what do people want to see? Does it become a self-fulfilling prophecy of dystopia or of fear? Then you will see what you want to see. But if you are genuinely an enlightened being, you will always try and find peace and harmony. And then within that, as you transition, you will also notice the capacity that how a human has the great capacity to create the environment that they want to have. And I don't mean just by social environment or the environment in which we live, but in any space, you can create what you want to have. It is up to you to do so. And so that may be stoic in its nature, but I tend to think that's the way that I would love to drive people's thoughts and aspirations. If they think it to be so, it can be so. And the
problem,
okay?
You're absolutely right, that the problem is that we just passed 8 billion of us on this planet. And there are 8 billion individual perceptions about what we should all be striving for. Mm-hmm. And the distillation that's happened in social media are these silos where if you're, a white supremacist, you can find millions of people that otherwise you wouldn't have been able to find to boost your perspective. If, on the other hand, you're an absolute believer of peace, love, and harmony, you can find millions who believe in that. But the reality is that it's competing views of what the world should be. We see it very starkly. In Canada, we have a multiplicity of political parties. So we have a little more nuance. In the United States, really, de facto, it's a two-party system. There are only two serious parties there, and they are absolutely in stark contrast to each other. And so, you can go to a Democrat rally and say, yeah, all we have to do is believe fervently in our belief, and it'll come true. And the Republican rally, and they'll say the exact same thing, except the core beliefs are substantially different. We were alluding to Roe v. Wade, to whether a woman has a right to control her reproductive freedom, is a completely different opinion between those two parties. And those two parties each individually represent close to 200 million American people. There is no world consensus, no one mind leading us all to whatever version of heaven on earth that you or I might want to have happen.
Thanks, James, for your call. I want to get to an email. We're coming up against the clock here, Robert, but Dee Dee's email says, regarding science fiction that predicts the future, I'm reading a lot of climate change fiction at the moment. There seems to be a huge growth in that genre right now, and what's so interesting is that Octavia Butler was writing about this back in the 1990s. Her Parable of the Sower and the Parable of the Talents books are grimly realistic, but ultimately hopeful. What is also creepily prescient is her authoritarian politician character whose slogan is "Make America Great Again."
Yes, Octavia Butler, who has passed away sadly, but I had the great pleasure of meeting her about 20 years ago. And of course, most significantly, a significant African-American science fiction writer, and B, a significant female science fiction writer. One of the things my field has been trying to do more and more is find ways to amplify diverse voices. And one of the greatest things that's happened in the last couple of years, sadly a little late for Octavia, who passed away, is that she has come into the forefront, the real attention her work is absolutely should have had decades ago is getting it today. She has had a street named after her, for instance. I think it was in her hometown. I mean, all kinds of wonderful stuff happening for Octavia Butler, Butler, Octavia Butler.
Robert, this has been such an interesting conversation. I feel like we could talk for hours about this because there's so many ways that this just applies to everyday life and everything that's going on. Before we go, quickly, in 30 seconds or less, plug why people should read your latest book, even though we've kind of talked about it, or pick one that you think they should pick up if they haven't read one of yours.
Oh, I think they should read any Robert J. Sawyer book. And the whole idea is that it will help prepare you to think about tomorrow. Good science fiction, I don't have a corner on this market. Good science fiction is a way to train your mind to think about the future and to help you actualize, as our previous caller said, the future that you really want to have. Give my books, Robert J. Sawyer, a try, but just try reading science fiction in general to expand your horizons.
What's the best book on the top of your head that you've read lately that's not yours?
The Mountain in the Sea by Ray Naylor, a Canadian-born science fiction writer about octopus intelligence. Very different than our intelligence. It's a science fiction novel, but about discovering that there is actually an octopus civilization under the sea.
Thank you so much for your time and sharing all of your research in your brain with us today. This has been such an interesting conversation. I hope that we can do this again sometime down the road.
My pleasure, Sam.